The death of Britannicus was far more horrifying than you imagine. When you think of Roman imperial murders, you probably picture dramatic assassinations in the Senate or bloody coups in the palace. But there was another child, one whose fate would reveal a darkness that makes even Nero's notorious cruelties pale in comparison. What you'll discover about the 13-year-old boy who should have been emperor will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, family, and the depths of human betrayal. The year was 55 AD, and Rome's streets echoed with the sounds of merchants hawking their wares, the clatter of chariot wheels on stone, and the murmur of citizens discussing the latest imperial scandals. But on that February evening, a different sound would soon fill the air. Not the roar of a bloodthirsty crowd gathering to witness a public execution, but something far more sinister, the suffocating silence of a conspiracy completed. A child murdered at his own birthday celebration while hundreds watched, powerless or complicit in the horror unfolding before them. What transpired that night was not merely an assassination, but a carefully orchestrated destruction of innocence that would haunt even the jaded Roman aristocracy. The popular imagination has reduced Britannicus to a footnote in Nero's rise to power, a minor obstacle removed through typical palace intrigue. But the reality was far more sinister, far more calculated, and infinitely more disturbing than the sanitized versions found in history books. Today, we strip away the myth and examine the unflinching reality of how a child emperor was systematically isolated, psychologically tortured, and finally eliminated by those who should have protected him. Tiberius Claudius Caesar Britannicus was born into a world of unimaginable privilege and power. As the biological son of Emperor Claudius and the infamous Messalina, he entered life in 41 AD as the automatic heir to the greatest empire the world had ever known. For his first 8 years, Britannicus lived as the undisputed future of Rome, surrounded by tutors who taught him Greek and Latin, military commanders who showed him maps of territories he would one day rule, and courtiers who bowed before him as they would before a god in training. His father Claudius, despite his physical disabilities and stammering speech, had proven himself a capable administrator who expanded the empire and brought stability after the chaos of Caligula's reign. The boy possessed what contemporary accounts describe as remarkable intelligence and a gentle disposition that contrasted sharply with the brutality of his surroundings. Unlike many imperial children who grew cruel under the weight of absolute power, Britannicus reportedly showed kindness to slaves and genuine interest in philosophy and governance. His tutors noted his quick grasp of complex political concepts and his unusual ability to remember names and faces of even minor court officials, a trait that would have served him well as emperor. He was particularly close to his father, who would often bring him to Senate meetings, seating him beside the imperial throne as if preparing Rome for the transition that would surely come. But this idyllic existence shattered in 48 AD, when his mother Messalina's spectacular downfall changed everything. The empress had engaged in a bizarre public marriage ceremony with her lover Gaius Silius, while still married to Claudius, an act of such brazen defiance that even Rome's libertine aristocracy was shocked. The conspiracy was exposed, Messalina was executed, and 7-year-old Britannicus suddenly found himself motherless and politically vulnerable. The trauma of losing his mother under such scandalous circumstances was compounded by the whispers that followed him through the palace corridors. Whispers questioning his legitimacy, his loyalty, even his sanity. The boy who had been groomed for greatness now carried the stain of his mother's disgrace, a mark that would prove impossible to wash away. The arrival of Agrippina the Younger as Claudius's fourth wife in 49 AD marked the beginning of Britannicus's systematic destruction. Agrippina was not merely ambitious. She was a force of nature who had survived the deadly politics of the Julio-Claudian dynasty through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and strategic marriages. She brought with her a son from a previous marriage, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who would soon be known as Nero. From the moment she entered the palace, Agrippina began a calculated campaign to elevate her own son while diminishing Britannicus's position. She understood that in the Roman imperial system there could be only one heir, and she was determined it would be Nero. The methods Agrippina employed were as subtle as they were cruel. She gradually replaced Britannicus's tutors with men loyal to her, ensuring that his education became increasingly restricted and controlled. The boy's access to his father was limited under various pretexts. Claudius was too busy with state affairs, or Britannicus needed to focus on his studies. When they did meet, Agrippina was always present, her watchful eyes ensuring no private conversation could take place. She spread rumors about the boy's mental instability, suggesting that his mother's madness had been inherited. Court physicians, bribed or threatened into compliance, began reporting concerns about Britannicus's episodes, though no one could quite specify what these episodes entailed. Physical isolation accompanied the psychological warfare. Britannicus was moved to quarters farther from the center of palace life, ostensibly for his own protection and comfort. His childhood companions were gradually removed, some sent away on distant assignments, others simply disappearing without explanation. The boy who had once played in the palace gardens with dozens of noble children now found himself increasingly alone, watched by guards who reported his every movement to Agrippina. Even his meals were monitored, with special tasters assigned not to protect him from poison, but to report what he ate and how much, information Agrippina could use to further her narrative of his declining health. The formal adoption of Nero by Claudius in 50 AD represented a crushing blow to Britannicus's hopes. The ceremony was lavish and public, with Nero receiving the name Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus and officially becoming part of the imperial family. At the same event, Britannicus was required to stand beside his new brother and publicly embrace him, a moment of forced affection that witnesses described as painfully awkward. The 11-year-old Britannicus reportedly trembled during the ceremony, whether from rage, fear, or humiliation, no one could say. From that day forward, Nero took precedence in all public appearances, while Britannicus was relegated to the shadows, a living reminder of a succession that would never be. The death of Claudius in 54 AD, almost certainly by poison, administered through Agrippina's machinations, sealed Britannicus's fate, though he wouldn't know it for another year. The 13-year-old emperor's death was kept secret for hours, while Agrippina secured the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard for Nero. When the death was finally announced, Nero was immediately proclaimed emperor at age 16, while 13-year-old Britannicus was not even mentioned in the official announcements. The boy, who should have been emperor by birthright, was forced to bow before his adoptive brother and swear loyalty in a public ceremony that must have been agony for the child who understood exactly what had been stolen from him. Under Nero's rule, Britannicus's situation deteriorated rapidly. The new emperor, despite his youth, understood that his adoptive brother represented the greatest threat to his legitimacy. Every time Britannicus appeared in public, silent questions arose among those who remembered the proper line of succession. Nero's advisors, particularly his tutor Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, counseled patience and subtle marginalization. But Agrippina, the architect of Nero's rise, knew that half measures would not suffice. As long as Britannicus lived, he would be a potential rallying point for those dissatisfied with Nero's rule. The boy's very existence was a rebuke to the new order. a living reminder of the violence and deception that had brought Nero to power. The relationship between the two boys was complex and toxic. Nero, older and now holding absolute power, would publicly humiliate Britannicus at every opportunity. During banquets, he would force the younger boy to sing or recite poetry, knowing that Britannicus's voice was beginning to change and would crack embarrassingly. He would ask Britannicus pointed questions about his mother's execution, watching with cruel satisfaction as the boy struggled to respond without showing emotion. Yet there were also moments of what appeared to be genuine affection, times when Nero would embrace Britannicus and call him little brother. Though whether these displays were sincere or simply another form of psychological torture remains unclear. As 55 AD began, the situation reached a critical point. Britannicus was approaching his 14th birthday, the age when Roman males formally entered adulthood by receiving the toga virilis. This ceremony would mark his transformation from child to man, from political non-entity to potential rival. More dangerously, rumors had begun circulating that some senators were considering supporting Britannicus's claim to the throne, viewing him as the legitimate heir who had been wrongfully displaced. Agrippina herself, increasingly frustrated by Nero's growing independence from her control, had reportedly threatened to support Britannicus's claim if Nero didn't show her proper respect. The boy who had been systematically destroyed was suddenly becoming a weapon in the larger power struggles of the imperial court. The planning for Britannicus's murder was meticulous and involved multiple layers of deception. Nero could not simply have the boy executed. He was still popular among many Romans who remembered his father fondly, and such an obvious fratricide would damage Nero's already questionable legitimacy. The death had to appear natural, or at least unprovable as murder. Nero turned to Locusta, a woman who had become infamous as the empire's most skilled poisoner. She had allegedly assisted Agrippina in killing Claudius and had been kept in comfortable imprisonment as a resource for future needs. Now she would be called upon to perform her darkest work yet, the murder of a child in full view of hundreds of witnesses. The first attempt failed spectacularly. During a dinner in early February, Britannicus was served wine that had been contaminated with a slow-acting poison designed to mimic illness. But whether through insufficient dosage or the intervention of a loyal servant who diluted the wine, Britannicus merely became ill and recovered within days. Nero's rage at this failure was volcanic. He personally beat Locusta and threatened her with crucifixion if she failed again. The poisoner, her life now hanging by a thread, promised a poison so powerful and fast-acting that it would leave no doubt as to its lethal efficiency. She reportedly tested it on a young slave who died in seconds, his body convulsing so violently that bones broke from the muscle contractions. The stage was set for February 13th, 55 AD. It was to be a celebration, ironically enough, a feast to celebrate the Saturnalia season and, some sources suggest, to mark Britannicus approaching his 14th birthday. The dining hall of the palace was filled with Rome's elite, reclining on couches in the traditional manner, eating delicacies imported from every corner of the empire. Britannicus was seated at the children's table, a deliberate humiliation for someone so close to manhood, but one that would serve Nero's purposes perfectly. The positioning meant Britannicus was visible to all but separated from the adult guests who might have intervened or questioned what was about to occur. The method of poisoning was ingenious in its simplicity. Roman custom dictated that hot wine be served at such feasts, but it would be cooled with water if too hot to drink. Britannicus's wine was tested by his taster, who suffered no ill effects. But when the boy complained the wine was too hot, a servant added cold water, water that had been treated with Locusta's concentrated poison. Britannicus took one sip and immediately began to convulse. His body rigid, foam emerged from his mouth, and his eyes rolled back as violent spasms racked his frame. The entire hall fell silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on the dying child as he writhed on the floor. Nero's performance in that moment was perhaps his greatest act of theatre. As Britannicus collapsed, the emperor remained perfectly calm, not even rising from his couch. "Be not alarmed," he announced to the horrified assembly. "My poor brother suffers from epilepsy, a condition he has endured since childhood. These fits appear frightening but will pass momentarily." The lie was delivered with such casual confidence that many in attendance wanted to believe it, needed to believe it, rather than confront the reality of what they were witnessing. No one dared challenge the emperor's words, even as Britannicus's convulsions grew more violent, even as his face turned purple and blood began to seep from his nose and ears. The most chilling aspect of the murder was the reaction of those present. Agrippina, the architect of so much death, reportedly went pale and gripped her couch, understanding immediately what was happening, but powerless to stop it. She had created a monster she could no longer control. Octavia, Nero's wife and Britannicus's biological sister, watched her brother die with tears streaming down her face, but she dared not speak or move to comfort him. The senators and nobles present carefully controlled their expressions, each understanding that showing too much sympathy for the dying boy might mark them as Nero's next victim. The only sounds in the hall were Britannicus's increasingly weak struggles and the continued consumption of wine and food by those desperate to appear unaffected. The poison worked with horrifying efficiency. Within minutes, Britannicus's convulsions began to weaken, his body exhausted from the violent muscle contractions. Blood vessels in his eyes had burst, giving them a hellish red appearance. His skin had taken on a mottled purple hue from lack of oxygen. Several witnesses later reported that in his final moments, Britannicus seemed to regain consciousness briefly, his eyes focusing on Nero with an expression of such profound betrayal and anguish that even hardened soldiers looked away. Then, with a final weak gasp, Tiberius Claudius Caesar Britannicus died on the cold marble floor, his body contorted in an unnatural position that spoke to the agony of his final moments. The aftermath was swift and ruthless in its efficiency. Nero immediately ordered that the body be removed and prepared for cremation that very night, citing concerns about contagion from his supposed illness. No proper funeral rites were observed, no period of mourning declared. The body was burned on a simple pyre in the Campus Martius during a convenient rainstorm that Nero claimed was the gods weeping for his beloved brother. The ashes were quietly interred without ceremony or marker, as if Britannicus had never existed at all. Those who had been close to the boy, servants, tutors, guards, disappeared within days, either executed or exiled to prevent any investigation or memorial. But certain details emerged that suggested the horror extended beyond mere poisoning. Some witnesses reported that Britannicus's body showed signs of sexual assault, though whether this occurred before or after death remained unclear. His personal effects were not returned to his sister Octavia, but were instead burned on Nero's orders, including childhood toys and letters from his father Claudius that might have provided evidence of his legitimate claim to the throne. Most disturbing of all, several accounts mention that Britannicus's face showed signs of having been painted with white lead makeup after death, possibly to hide the discoloration caused by the poison, a grotesque attempt to make the corpse appear peaceful that only emphasized the violence of his end. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing decades later, would record a particularly haunting detail. On the night of the murder, as Britannicus's body was being hastily prepared for cremation, the rain washed away the makeup that had been applied to hide the poison's effects. Those who saw the body in its true state reported that the boy's features were so distorted by the poison that he was barely recognizable as human, let alone as the beautiful child he had been just hours before. The image of that ravaged face, revealed by rain in the flickering torchlight, would haunt those present for the rest of their lives. The psychological impact on those forced to witness the murder without intervening cannot be understated. Many of the dinner guests reportedly suffered from nightmares and what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Several prominent Romans withdrew from public life entirely after that night, unable to continue participating in a system that could allow such horror. Octavia, forced to continue living as Nero's wife after watching him murder her brother, descended into a depression from which she would never fully recover. Even Agrippina, who had orchestrated so many deaths, seemed broken by the reality of what her ambitions had created. She would spend her remaining years in a state of paranoid fear, knowing that the son she had elevated to power was entirely capable of matricide. The murder of Britannicus marked a turning point in Nero's reign and in Roman history itself. It demonstrated that the new emperor would not be constrained by any moral boundaries, not even those that prevented the murder of children. The senators who had considered supporting Britannicus's claim fell silent, understanding that opposition to Nero meant death. The Praetorian Guard, enriched by generous donatives from Nero following the murder, made clear their loyalty was to whoever could pay them, not to justice or legitimacy. Rome had entered a new phase of imperial terror, where even being a child offered no protection from the emperor's paranoia. Modern historians have uncovered additional evidence that makes the crime even more chilling. Analysis of surviving accounts suggests that Britannicus may have been slowly poisoned over months before the final dose, explaining the references to his supposed illness that Nero cited. This would mean the boy spent his final months knowing he was being murdered, but unable to prove it or escape it. There are also suggestions that Nero forced Britannicus to participate in degrading sexual acts in the weeks before his death, using the threat of immediate execution to ensure compliance. These details, while not definitively proven, align with what we know of Nero's character and methods. Perhaps most disturbing is a letter fragment discovered in the 20th century, allegedly written by one of Britannicus's tutors shortly before his own disappearance. The text, partially destroyed by time, contains the line, "The child knows what comes but maintains his dignity." If authentic, this suggests Britannicus faced his murder with full knowledge of what was happening, choosing to attend the fatal dinner rather than flee and be hunted down like an animal. The courage required for a 13-year-old boy to walk knowingly to his death, to maintain composure while his killer smiled at him across the room, represents a form of heroism that transcends the brutal politics of ancient Rome. The speed with which Britannicus was erased from Roman memory was remarkable even by the standards of political murder. Within weeks of his death, it was as if he had never existed. His name was removed from official documents, his statues destroyed, his birthday removed from the calendar of celebrations. Nero even went so far as to rename some of Britannicus's former possessions that bore inscriptions of his name, giving them to favorites as gifts without mentioning their origin. This systematic erasure extended to art and literature. Poets who had written verses praising the young prince found themselves ordered to destroy their work or face exile. Yet the ghost of Britannicus would haunt Nero for the rest of his reign. Multiple sources report that the emperor suffered from recurring nightmares about his murdered brother. He would wake screaming about eyes full of blood staring at him from the darkness. During his famous theatrical performances, Nero would sometimes freeze mid-scene, claiming to see Britannicus in the audience. As his reign descended into greater madness and cruelty, some observers suggested he was trying to outrun the memory of that February night, committing ever greater atrocities to drown out the image of a dying child on the dining room floor. The manner of Britannicus's death also established a precedent for the use of poison as a political tool in imperial Rome. Locusta, rewarded with wealth and protection for her success, would go on to train other poisoners, creating what amounted to a school for assassination. The techniques she developed for killing Britannicus, particularly the use of delayed action poisons that mimicked natural illness, would be employed repeatedly in the following decades. In a very real sense, the murder of Britannicus professionalized political poisoning in Rome, transforming it from a desperate act into a routine tool of statecraft. What makes Britannicus's fate particularly tragic is how unnecessary his death was from any practical perspective. By 55 AD, Nero's position was secure. He had the support of the Praetorian Guard, the acquiescence of the Senate, and the general acceptance of the Roman people. Britannicus, isolated and powerless, posed no real threat. His murder was not political necessity, but psychological compulsion. Nero killed him not because he needed to, but because he could. The death of Britannicus was pure cruelty, the exercise of power for its own sake, the destruction of innocence, simply to prove that innocence could be destroyed. The story of Britannicus forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power and human nature. Here was a child born to rule the known world, raised with every advantage civilization could provide, yet ultimately helpless against the machinery of ambition and cruelty that surrounded him. His death was witnessed by hundreds of Rome's most powerful and educated citizens, yet not one person tried to save him. The collective paralysis of that dining hall, the willingness of an entire society to watch a child die rather than risk their own positions, speaks to something dark in human nature that transcends any particular historical period. In the end, Britannicus's greatest crime was simply existing. He was a living reminder of legitimate succession, of the proper order of things, of what Rome might have been under different circumstances. His mere presence was a silent accusation against those who had stolen his birthright and murdered his father. Every breath he took was a challenge to the fabricated reality Nero and Agrippina had constructed. In such a system, his death was perhaps inevitable. Not because he was dangerous, but because truth itself had become dangerous in an empire built on lies. The archaeological evidence adds another layer of horror to the tale. Recent excavations in areas of the palace where Britannicus lived have uncovered what appears to be evidence of violent struggle. Scratches on walls at child height, damaged furniture consistent with someone being forcibly restrained. While we cannot definitively link these findings to Britannicus specifically, they suggest the violence he endured may have extended far beyond that final poisoning. The physical space of his suffering still bears witness to crimes we can only partially reconstruct from written sources. Contemporary accounts also hint at something even more disturbing that occurred after Britannicus's death. Several sources mention that parts of his body were preserved in some fashion, though the exact details are frustratingly vague. One historian references the emperor's private collection of memories, while another mentions that which should have been burned but was kept. If these cryptic references are accurate, they suggest Nero may have kept physical trophies from his murdered brother, transforming Britannicus, even in death, into an object for his twisted satisfaction. The thought of the young emperor preserving parts of his victim's body adds a serial killer-like dimension to what was already a horrific crime. The fate of those who showed sympathy for Britannicus after his death reveals the totality of Nero's cruelty. A young senator who proposed modest funeral honors for the dead prince was found dead within a week, supposedly from sudden illness. A poet who wrote a veiled elegy for a fallen eagle too young to fly was exiled to a remote island where he died under mysterious circumstances. Even slaves who were heard weeping for their young master disappeared without explanation. The message was clear. Britannicus was not only dead, but was to be unremembered, unmourned, unerased from history, except as a cautionary tale about challenging imperial power. As we reflect on the horror of Britannicus's murder, we confront questions that echo across centuries. How does a 13-year-old boy face death with such dignity while surrounded by adults who chose complicity over courage? What does it say about civilization itself that such a crime could occur in full view of society's elite with no consequences for the perpetrator? The dining hall where Britannicus died was not some hidden dungeon, but the heart of Roman power, filled with philosophers, poets, generals, and statesmen, yet not one of them moved to help a dying child. The story of Britannicus ultimately asks us to consider the price of silence in the face of evil. Every person in that dining hall who chose to continue eating while a child died on the floor made a calculation that their own comfort was worth more than justice. They told themselves that intervention was impossible, that Nero's power was absolute, that one more death in Rome's bloody history meant nothing. But in their collective silence, they became accomplices to one of history's most grotesque crimes, the public murder of a child whose only offense was having been born with a legitimate claim to power. The mystery that haunts historians to this day is not how Britannicus died. That much is clear from multiple sources. The true mystery is what might have been found in the private papers of Claudius that were destroyed after his death. Some fragments suggest the emperor had written a secret will naming Britannicus as his sole heir and explicitly excluding Nero. If such a document existed, it would mean that everyone involved in Nero's rise knew they were complicit in subverting the legitimate succession. Were they all protecting a terrible secret that would have invalidated Nero's entire reign? Or was there something even darker? Perhaps evidence that Britannicus was not Claudius's biological son, but still the chosen heir, making his murder even more senseless. The final terrible irony of Britannicus's story is that his death accomplished nothing lasting for those who killed him. Nero would rule for only 13 more years before being forced to commit suicide, dying friendless and unmourned. Agrippina would be murdered by her own son just 4 years after Britannicus, beaten to death on Nero's orders in a fulfillment of the violence she had taught him. Locusta the poisoner would be executed by Nero's successor Galba, dying by the very methods she had perfected. The empire they had all killed to control would soon pass to other hands, other families, as if the murder of an innocent boy had cursed everyone involved in it. Today, when we speak of Britannicus, we remember not a failed emperor or a political footnote, but a child whose dignity in the face of systematic cruelty stands as an indictment of those who destroyed him. His story reminds us that power without conscience creates monsters, that ambition without morality destroys even those who achieve their goals, and that the silence of good people in the face of evil makes them complicit in that evil. The boy, who should have been emperor, became something more powerful in death than he ever could have been in life. A permanent reminder of innocence destroyed, potential eliminated, and the horrific cost of political ambition unchecked by human decency. But perhaps the most chilling question remains unanswered. In those final moments, as the poison coursed through his young body and he looked into the eyes of his murderer, did Britannicus see just Nero's cruelty? Or did he see something worse? The face of an empire that would watch a child die rather than risk speaking truth to power? And if the latter, what does that say about the nature of civilization itself, that it could produce such systematic cruelty and call it governance? Was the death of Britannicus merely the removal of a political rival, or was it something far more terrible, the ritual sacrifice of innocence itself on the altar of imperial power, a sacrifice that Rome would repeat again and again until the empire itself collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. The blood that flowed from Britannicus's dying body that February night would seep into the foundations of the palace, into the marble of the dining hall, into the very soil of Rome itself. And there it remains, an indelible stain on human history, a reminder that monsters are not born but made, and that the greatest horrors are not those committed in darkness, but those performed in full view of people who choose to look away. The ghost of Britannicus haunts us still, asking the question that none who witnessed his murder could answer. When power demands the death of innocents, who among us has the courage to say no?